Hello, hello, Mr. Indian. Hello, my Indo-Trinbagonian. I bring you love from deep, deep, deep within me. Love meant to clear the hurdles of our history. But there is one thing we must never fail to understand. The African was the first to come here, then the Indian came second. And African toil and they labor. And they cried and they died under master. So when you celebrating the richness of your culture, you Africa, plenty more than you owe India. Cause the torture we went through is alien to you. The only contract we had was with death. The road you come and trod, made with African blood. Thank God that's now a historical silhouette. So celebrate your African brothers. Reach out and touch and make up this stagger. For all those who walk the plank, from whom culture was young, Mr. Indian man, it's time you tell the African dance. Oh, line, 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 if Miss Europe had 2 yard boys in her service, and she emasculated the first one of the two, dehumanize, deculturize, and dismiss. Make him sweat, for no pay he going to be blue. And when he escaped on the fire, he quit the job and room. The next boy just stripped in with pay and passage to go home. Plus his food, his family, and his culture, and freedom to worship and together. The first boy must feel a double sense of deep hurt and target the latter who was shown a greater sense of self-worth. But we will never let them facts lead us into racial cracks. We will not succumb to the leanings of that era. We choose to look beyond recrimination, to stay away from all conflict and from fracas. So celebrate your African brother. Give him a front seat in your Diwali Naga. Don't bother to pull rank with your money in the bank, Mr. Indian man. It's time you tell the African dance. Oh, blah, 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 blah. Apart from a very small group of the Mandingo who went back home to Gambia and Senegal, all the ex-slaves they remain in Trinbago, adopting diverse moods of living and survival. But whereas the land for the Indians spelled prosperity, For Africans, it just means more pain and misery. And the curse of the land was so vivid that for some, even work was blacklisted. So when Indian became this multiple landowner, it's because African was running from their anathema. We're not lazy, that's the truth, and we're very brave too. We love to sing, we love to dance, but don't you be fooled. For we true identity, just look beyond slavery for invention that no slavery can overrule. So celebrate your African brother. From when he starts, he's a big, big time achiever. He embraces you in his rank. So if we must be frank, Mr. Indian man, it's time you tell the African dance. Isn't it so hot? Here, bam, 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 not lazy, that's the truth, and we're very brave too. We love to sing, we love to dance, but don't you be fooled. For we true identity, just look beyond slavery for invention that no slavery can overrule. So celebrate your African brother. From when he starts, he's a big, big time achiever. He embraces you in his rank. So if we must be frank, Mr. Indian man, it's time you tell the African dance. Isn't it so hot? Here, bam, 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 my love for you is not about your food or your woman, although such things form a lesser part of the mix. It just makes sense in this captive situation to build upon with historical dynamics. So don't be so quick to jump at a calypso. 100 songs give you praise, take the holistic view. Don't be caught using race as a divider. And you are black, cause Indian is not a color. Don't you hide under the guise of education and use university to cause no great division. The richness we both share because we end up here. Neither one will enjoy back in we homeland. We're very polyglot, plenty flavor in the pot. The sum total of each other's contribution. So celebrate your African brother. He helped to break the caste system in India. The Ganges water I drank, so meet me on Nile River bank, Mr. Indian man. It's time you tell the African dance. Oh, lam bam 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 lam bam bam bam
I pause because this kind of music brings tears to my eyes. The brother gave a thesis Uh, People like myself take a whole PhD degree to put on paper what that brother, Roy Lewis, the mystic prowler, put in four verses and chorus. Mr. Indian, say thanks to the African. Move past the title quickly and go to the essence of the calypso. African history beyond slavery, before slavery, the African contribution to the humanization of the so-called New World. Profound, profound, profound. Good evening and welcome to you. Welcome to Politics 101. Politics 101. Say thanks to the African. You know, people cuss us out because we talk about prior arrival. The Calypsonian says, our prior arrival talk is not about superiority. He talks about the polyglot. You are as much part of me as I am part of you, but I was here first. And the Europeans had two of us. They demonize one and they give one an apparent pass with his culture, his language and everything. Land. And therein lies the roots of our division. But we think our division has to do with something that the African did. The Calypsonians said, we helped to bring an end to the caste system in India. True, true, true. The caste system in India was partly about Africans. We were the Dalits, we were the untouchables. We teach history not to cause trouble. We teach history to prevent trouble. We talk about African history not to cause trouble, but to prevent trouble. Lord knows, given what we went through, we should not be talking to people. As the Calypsonian said, we took our Indian brothers or Amerindian brothers or Portuguese brothers, Chinese brothers, we took you in our ranks. When you mix with black and Chinese, they don't take you. When you mix with black and white, they don't take you. They call you all kind of names, colored, biracial, this. When you mix, we just take you. And we just take you as African, as black people. No other race does that. You all think about it. You all think about it. Think about it. Think about it. We do not exclude, we include. We include. Because there is a humanism. We came from Africa with our humanism. Actually, we gave the world humanity. We came from Africa with our humanity. And even slavery could not take that humanity from us. I say this not to say that we are better than any other group, because we are not. I say that to say that we are equal, and the world is still to acknowledge our equal humanity. Good evening and welcome to Politics 101 on a Wednesday night. Brother Eric Phillips is here. Chief Eric Phillips is here. And we are going to be talking our thing. Tonight we want to talk about development among the Black youth. Development among the Black youth. Overnight we got information that the police swooped down on the parents, the mother and the grandmother of Melissa Atwell, known to most of you as Melly Mel, and there's a lot of condemnation and so on. And we want to join with others in expressing solidarity with the sister, because they're trying to get at her. But I want to say something that nobody else in the so-called political arena, you're going to hear it from some of us in the cultural arena, but in the political arena will not tell you. There are Indian people who speak out against this government. Not many of them, but some of them speak out against this government. But I bet you my bottom dollar, the PPP is not going to send the police to go and harass the 56-year-old mother and 87-year-old grandmother. They're going to do things against Indians who speak out against them, but they're not going to send the police to hunt two elderly women down. And one of the problems is, well, Melly Mel speak out against the government and they're going after, but they're going after because she's a Black woman. And you want to know? And Moko, they knelt on Black women, they beat Black women. In front of the hospital, they licked down Black women's stalls. At Hillfoot, Mackenzie, they licked down Black women houses. They spit on a Black woman who was guarding them while they sleep. Melly Mel is not the first Black woman, not the first Black woman they've gone after. But you see, we Black people can't bring ourselves to say they're going after her not because she's a woman or because she's young, or they're going after her because she's a Black woman who should be in her place. And they reserve the harshest. You think they're going to go to an Indian 50-something-year-old woman, 80-something-year-old Indian woman and say, we come because we find drugs outside your gate? Americans call it dog whistle. It's racism. They didn't say they're going to find gun. After all, if you want to overthrow the government, they're going to say you store some gun. But they didn't go and find gun. They said they're going to find weed. Black people, recreation drug of choice. You all understand? You all understand? I see the politicians, the political parties have put out statements of condemning Melly Mel right to free speech and so on, and they're in order. But all of them have avoided the real issue. And that is they're going after that woman and her family because she's a Black woman. If she were an Indian woman protesting against them, exposing them, they'll go to her with a bag of money. And your Black people are not seeing and calling it for what it is. Dr. Henry Jeffrey was here last night. And he started off by saying Bertie Ramcharan was trying to shield the PPP. And the PPP couldn't understand it. And at first, many of you wanted to know what was he talking about. And he made the point. The problem in Guyana is not autocracy. The problem in Guyana is that the PPP is an Indian autocracy. The PPP is an ethnic autocracy, and our politicians are failing to say that. We're going to talk about young people tonight. And I hear them saying that young people this and young people that and so on. And we don't mobilize young people the right way. I took time out when I was in Guyana for those 4 months to spend a lot of time talking to young people. And young people are much more racially conscious than we think they are. They're not joiners. Unlike my generation, Eric's generation, when we used to join, these young people are not joiners, but doesn't mean they're not conscious. And they understand while they're being beaten down. They understand they're being beaten down because of their race. But our leaders do not reinforce it. Yes, they can give $40,000 to our young people and tell them, put on a red jersey and go to a PYO conference, and they parade them like ornaments, like where they used to do them during slavery. And our poor young people don't have the kind of consciousness and contact with the history to understand what is happening to them in real time. But their leaders know that history. And their leaders will say everything except that. If the leaders are fearful of saying, I am black, I am proud, I am beautiful, and I'm a human being, why do you expect the followers to say it? Yes, this is an ethno-racial autocracy. And Melly Mel is targeted in the way that she's targeted. I'm not saying they wouldn't target an Indian woman who come out against them. They will target anybody who comes out against them. But they target black people in a certain way. Plant weed on them because they're weed people. That's what they think of us. Good evening. We're going to be talking tonight with Brother Chief Eric Phillips, and we're going to be talking about black youth, the black youth, and development, because we ain't going to develop if the black youth are not developed. And black youth can be developed with $40,000 part-time job and a little contract for a $2 million, and they can only carry home $200,000 to their family. They're not going to be developed like that. So that's what we want to talk about tonight. Welcome. Let me bring in Chief Eric. Chief Eric, Jambo.
Good evening, Chief Uhuru. That Calypsonian was extremely profound, and I don't think we make them like him anymore. We need to, because they were the ones that fostered change. It was interesting that he said, Indian isn't a color, black is. And
Yes.
it goes to share with us his understanding of the broader context of what happened before slavery, during slavery, and after slavery. So it was quite fascinating. And like you said, we would take a thesis to do that. He did that in 4 minutes.
There you go. There you go. And that is why, Eric, I say, when God was giving us gifts to give to the world, he gave us a great gift. And that is the Caribbean gift to the world, the Black Caribbean gift to the world. I say it is the greatest music in the world because it does things that other musics do, but it does more. My student always asks me, Dr. Hines, you all dance to that? And I said, yes, we are unique. We dance to politics. Eric, your thoughts on this Melly Mel development? Any thoughts on that?
It is so foolish and so obvious to everyone what has happened that it shows a sense of desperation and stupidity that is surpassed only by autocracy. Why would you send somebody to a 57-year-old and an 87-year-old and plant weed? Anybody with a common sense, a 3-year-old would see through that. But it also is silly because the world sees it too, and the world understands what's going on, and it's counterproductive. I just don't understand what type of warped mind would conceive something like this, you know? It's
Eric,
just
you have
amazing.
studied history much more than me, because I used to listen to you and others talk about African history going back to the period of what they now call in the literature antiquity, and so
Right.
so you understand that history. And when you ask the question, I understand. I take it's a rhetorical question. What kind of mind would want to do something like this? Well, it's a mind that is steeped in racial supremacy. And when you live in a place like Guyana, to carry out your design of racial supremacy, you have to subdue those who should be most literate about racial domination and who are more given to respond and push back against racial domination. And so you've got to put them in their place, and you put them in their place in the most frightening way. Am I wrong?
Yeah, yeah. What is hilarious with this discussion about autocracy, because of that letter Shades of Autocracy, is the fact that we try to mamagai ourselves. As I said previously, in 1763, Guyana was an autocratic state, and we had coffee. In 1823, Guyana was an autocratic state when we had when we had Commoner and John Gladstone. In 1838, when Damon revolted peacefully, we were autocratic state. Winner take all is an autocratic state. So when we try to dance around it that we're not autocratic and not we our DNA is autocratic. And when you have an ethnic autocracy, things become even more warped. And that's what we're seeing. So I laugh when I see all these articles now defending whether we are autocratic or not as a joke, because these are intellectuals who are just speaking diarrhea through their mouths because they know we are an autocratic state because that's in our DNA. The country is, and that's why we need to change the constitution. The constitution is an autocratic constitution.
The Constitution is an autocratic constitution. Brother Eric Phillips here tonight. Brother Phillips, Ravram Korana said, look, this thing about um, constitutional reform that they're talking about, they should put it aside and they should concentrate on two things: governance and the powers of the president. Because those are the two most pressing areas for constitutional reform. And I think that is partly consistent with what you are saying about
Well,
the
to
village.
some extent, but we need to get rid of the entire constitution. I
Okay?
know Lincoln Lewis talks about Article 13.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a fringe issue.
Not
We
enforceable.
need a constitution that is inclusive. Whether you deal with the governance arrangements, what type of governance arrangements? The Constitution says that the president is the supreme ruler and can make any decision. What are you going to do in reform? How are you going to reform that other than to dilute that power completely? But you can't. And what arrangements are you talking about? You know, there are institutions and then there are people that execute the functions of an institution. We could have the best institutions in the world. If you put bad people there or racial people, it's going to be, it will fail. I look at how we think through small eyes. We don't need an ethnic relations commission because that talks about ethnic rights. What we need is a human rights commission, because the human rights commission will not only deal with ethnic rights, it will deal with all rights and all freedoms. And then how do we constitute a human rights commission? We say that all of the heads of the ethnic relation committee and this female committee and this are going to become members of a human rights committee. They're unqualified because human rights has a special type of architecture. It has special skills, a special understanding of international human rights law. So we design these things to fail. Ethnic Relations Commission is not something we need in Guyana. That only fits with an autocratic constitution that talks about winner take all. So we
And
design these things to failure
of course, there
purposefully.
is a provision there for a human rights commission. They never activated that human rights commission.
But even it's designed, it says the heads of all the other groups, ethnic relation, this
Mhm.
one, indigenous rights, all going to come together. They're all unqualified to be human rights commission. If you look at human rights commissions around the world, there are lawyers, there are people highly educated, there are people who are dealing with a lot of issues that are not centered around politics. They're centered around rights. Ethnic relation committee and its composition, one from the private sector, one from this. We got this recipe. That's a disastrous recipe. In any normal society, you have four different elements. You have the government, which includes the opposition. You have the private sector. You then have the civil society. And then you have the fourth estate, because there are four of them, which is the media. Our private sector controls civil society. I mean, it's all intermingled. And the private sector is controlled by politics. So all we have done is to create a system that is disastrous because we are an autocratic society. We've designed autocracy in all of our institutions. It's ridiculous.
It is ridiculous. John Jones is saying here the black youths are grappling at $40,000 and a red jersey because they see that the black leaders are not leading. Any thoughts there?
He is 10% right. The issue is, what are the options available to black youth? What are the options available to any youth in Guyana? If there are no options, they'll grab at anything because they're impoverished. They don't see a future. They're committing suicide. They're doing all sorts of things. So the $40,000 is just survival. But that has nothing to do with leadership, even though leadership is part of it.
Leadership is part of it. Eric, let's get into the issue of tonight, and that is the development of the black youth, because of course the majority of our population is young. The majority of the African population is made up of young people, and often we pay lip service to youth, but we do not get into a profound way in terms of crafting policies that are going to benefit young people.
Right.
And you have been thinking about this issue. Your rationale for talking about youth development, in addition to other kinds of development, but that youth development is important. Why?
Well, David, youth are the essence of any democracy. When you're talking about development, youth are the essence of development. Development is a human thing. It's not about housing and cars. It's about people. And if you have a youth population that doesn't have agency, that doesn't have access to capital, that isn't trained properly, doesn't have the right education, you're creating an environment where your society will suffer. And so when I talk about youth tonight, I'm going to talk generically about all youth in Guyana, because that's how I approached it when I was at the University of Guyana. I taught more Indian youth than African youth. But the elements are the same. And then I customize it to African youth because there are some special needs. But I also want to give some background, because since 1996, I've been at this, looking at you. The Guyana 21 plan, with Stanley Ming, Supriya Singh, Jerome Khan, myself, Malcolm Chowki, Joe Singh, everybody put together. That was a youth plan, a plan that looked into the future. Of course, in 2020, that was converted into Guyana 2030. But I also wanted to say that in 2008, I started to really focus on this, even though the Guyana 21 plan was in 1996. Because in working at ACDA in a volunteer way with a school, I started to realize that we had a lot of at-risk African communities. And so I approached the IDB, Inter-American Development Bank, and they gave us an $80,000 grant that we had to match at AGDA. And what we did was to get 10 young people each from Buxton, Agricola, and Alboystown and put them through a whole year training. They got 17,000 Ghana dollars a month for transportation. Of course, they got meals. They came to AGDA's building 5 days a week. They were taught leadership. They were taught community development. They were taught media. They were taught agriculture. They were taught entrepreneurship. And the way I approached that program was to follow the White House Fellows program I was fortunate to be in. So during the week, they'll get courses, but then they'll meet the who's who in Guyana. So an ambassador would come and speak with them, somebody from the banking sector. They visited Channel 9 to talk about media. They had people of all races, Joe Singh, Rupert Rupnarain, ambassadors, Stanley Ming. We had Black entrepreneurs speak to them. And then they had to go and do a project. So they created their own garden. And in each of the communities, remember there were 5 males and 5 women, 5 males and 5 females from each of the 3 communities. That's how I met Sister Yvette in Buxton, because Buxton was the centerpiece of it, working with Tukuntu. And so as I started to observe those young people, and by the way, they've all done extremely well, I started to realize that we had an illiterate society. And so that same year in 2008, I wrote a letter calling for a national conversation on literacy, which just raised its head a few weeks ago, because all the issues that are now in front of us, with failing grades in math and English and all of that, I saw since 2008. And I was trying to get a national conversation for us to start grabbing with this. And this was even before oil. Because if you have an illiterate population, whether it's cultural, psychological, academic or not, your society is at risk. And our society right now is really at risk because 10 years from now, most of the workers in this country will be non-Guyanese of all races, because the education system is misaligned to our economic future. And we have to revamp the entire education system. We have to look at education systems in Scandinavia and China and Europe to see what works, especially now that we're going into a technological age. We've passed the information age, we've passed the industrial age. Now we're into a very different type of age where knowledge is power. So if your young people are not exposed to this knowledge, or are miseducated, or are uneducated, and you have all these assets in Guyana, where you have oil, manganese, gold, rare earths, uranium. We can grow 200 fruits and vegetables. We have 300 waterfalls. We have 100 and something mountains. You know, we're not prone to hurricanes and earthquakes. Everybody is going to look at us and try to exploit us. And we're starting to see that, plus the migration we've had of tertiary grads. So as you saw in the labor study a few years ago, 10% of our workforce have never gone to school. That's amazing. And when you combine primary and secondary education, less than 50% of our students or our workforce have primary and secondary education. And then it comes to tertiary education degrees, less than 3%. And we're moving into a high-tech economy. So I saw that since 2008. But I started to address it differently. Remember, we had a massive HIV and AIDS problem in Guyana. So I created Dance Alive, which was a youth program, and I created 26 A to Z tapes, A for abstinence, B for be faithful, C, and use edutainment to try to educate our youth, because I know that from an academic point of view, they weren't reading, they weren't good at math. So I tried to do that. But then I got involved heavily in youth development by writing in 2010 a 10-10-10 plan for Linden, Region 10. So it was 10-10-10, Region 10, 10 years, 10% growth rate. And what I said in that document, and I still have that document, is that Linden, Region 10, should form a development corporation similar to what New Jersey and New York and all the other states do. Create a development fund, go overseas and find investors because you know what it is you want. And that you would have set up government structures and investment structures to bring business to you. And since Linden was on the road to Brazil, which we wrote on in the Guyana 21 plan, then that would be a hub. And we could do light manufacturing, we could do assembling, we can do agriculture, we can do all these types of things. Now, that plan I gave to Linden and they'd never used it. And I read it today. It's still extremely relevant because it emphasized agriculture, it emphasized tourism, it emphasized entrepreneurship, it emphasized a lot of things that would have been relevant to them today in oil because they're buying most of their food from else places. Then, because of the linkage between young Black entrepreneurs and older Black entrepreneurs, in 2015, as head of the Guyana Reparations Committee, I launched with a group of people the African Business Council. And the main event we had that year, we invited all the top Black businessmen and women in Guyana and gave them awards and tried to bring them together. And we invited Eddie Grant to get the Businessman of the Decade award because of who Eddie Grant was. Nothing came out of that because it was then a small private sector, it still is, and they were still afraid that if they got political or if they got active in a Black business council, they'd be discriminated against because that's the reality. And then in 2018, when I founded the African Business Roundtable with AGDA, what did Imam Roshan Khan says? It's racism because Black people getting together to talk business and they can stop buying from Indians, and there's racism. This type of illiteracy and this type of racism that doesn't want Black people to be in business. So having said that, I again go back to 2008, where I wrote this document, which is the African Renaissance in Guyana. These were 7 letters, and these 7 letters dealt with the political imperatives of African Guyanese, economic imperatives of African Guyanese, psychological, social, cultural, international, and I put it together in an African Renaissance. And I want to read what was the summary of that, David. It says here, African Renaissance imperatives. We build together, we share together, we are one. Shared governance is a fundamental human right of Africans in Guyana. Stimulate cultural pride and the courage to prevail against all odds. Nurture commitment of self-determination through self-employment. A commitment to tackling the scourge of HIV and AIDS, which was bad at the time. The economic, social, cultural, and political revitalization of our villages. Recapture the importance of a sound education as a basis for economic sustainability. Nurture and create youth leaders committed to self-determination, self-employment, respect for all cultures, justice, equity, and the rule of law. Bring all African organizations and all African leaders together. The African intelligentsia must immerse itself in the struggle to end poverty, ignorance, and backwardness in our society. African Guyanese to take control of their own destiny, economically, politically, socially, psychologically, and culturally. And these were 7 letters I wrote over 7 weeks. I got 9 death threats. I had 2 attempts. Kissoon called me Hitlerite. He said, who gave me the permission to speak on behalf of Africans? And all I was trying to do was to look at the environment, look at the status of our education in our villages and among Black people. Look at our villages which were not being developed since the village movement because of all sorts of political maneuverings. And I said to myself, having lived in South Africa for 7.5 years and having been involved in Mbeki's African Renaissance, I took some of those principles. Now, David, those elements, political, economic, psychological, social, cultural, international, are all part of a youth development strategy. Because through that, you give our youth agency, you give them entrepreneurship, you give them the ability to want to self-determination, which is again owning your own business. It talks about the deficiencies, access to capital, teamwork. How do you have teamwork to build corps? All of those types of things. But people did not see that because they're accustomed to seeing 1 + 1 = 2, when 1 + 1 in business is really equal 11. And After that, I started to put together a whole lot of plans. This is a document I wrote in 2018. It's 65 pages. It's called Youth Development. And I went through the theory of youth development. But I also gave the reasons for youth unemployment and youth underdevelopment in Guyana. And there were 10. Here are the 10. A globally non-competitive private sector. This is prior to oil, right? We had a globally non-competitive private sector without technology, without research, without capital. We were just traders. And in order to build youth, in order to give them sustainable development, we had to have a private sector that pulled them. But our private sector was non-competitive. The second reason was that Guyana's economic paradigms over the last 30 years were not suitable for a developing country. I mean, you can go back to Burnham time and the ERP and what happened after that, and Jagan's socialism and all of that. When you looked at our economic model, it never created jobs, it created debt, it created poverty, it created dependency, and only now oil is saving us. If you look at our GDP to debt ratio over that time, you would see it. If you look at what was going on in the sugar industry, you would see it. If you look at what's going on in the bauxite industry, you would see it. Because we were a commodities-based economy. We weren't doing value added. Therefore, education didn't mean anything. Therefore, entrepreneurship didn't mean anything. So that was the second reason. The third reason for youth unemployment in Guyana is our human capital is inadequate for sustainable development. And that's because of our educational system. Our education system is still developed to nurture other economies, European economies, American economy, Canadian economy. It's not nurtured to build the Guyana economy. And it's totally misaligned right now with the oil economy. And that's why you're seeing we're promoting this mirage of we topping the Caribbean. We got 110 students that are 38 subjects and all of that. When beneath that pyramid, 98% of our students are failing. Now, if you're going to develop a workforce built based on youth, and you're undereducating them, or you're not educating them, and you're not capitalizing entrepreneurship, then you're building a society at risk for your whole economy to be taken over in the future. And now that we have oil, you could see what's going on. The fourth reason was migration of tertiary grads. There's a big, when I came back from South Africa, I was shocked. We had old people or older people who were very educated. Then we had a missing middle class, all who went overseas. And then we had our youth. So there was no mentorship. There was no connection in the village between our elders, our brighter people, or people in business and our youth. And youth need nurturing. So that was the fourth. Fifth was misalignment of the education system. Six was widespread corruption and money laundering. 7 was an outdated immigration policy. 8 was the lack of manufacturing. 9 was that we have a small local market. It's only because of oil our market is expanding. We only had 1 million people on 83,000 square miles. England is less than 83,000 square miles, and they got 70 million people. We had no cross-border trade with Suriname, no cross-border trade with Venezuela, no cross-border trade with Brazil. And if you know international business, most of your business is done with your neighbors. America's largest trading partner is Canada and Mexico because of cross-border dynamics. So we had none of that. And then I created solutions. There were 10 solutions to those problems. The first for youth was an entrepreneurship ecosystem, and I described it. Right now, we teach entrepreneurship, and we leave out the ecosystem. A critical part of entrepreneurship, especially for youth, is mentorship. We don't have enough mentors in Guyana, but we have them in the diaspora, but we haven't connected them to the diaspora. We don't have an economic vision so that the people in the diaspora could reach back and invest in our youth for continuity. But what you're having is where you have cottage industries. The Chinese are coming in and taking over supermarkets and taking in entry market businesses that our youth can actually participate. This economy is a high-tech economy. How are our youth going to participate in it if they have no access to technology, no access to capital, they're uneducated, and they don't have networks to go and get these things? The second solution was a modern national service. I know a lot of people jump up and down when they hear about national service. I wasn't here. I heard good things about it. I heard bad things about it. But my concept of it, somebody trying to get me, was to have a new type of national service where our technical schools, our vocational schools, our universities would be linked into a work apprenticeship program where our youth would learn skills that are linked to a particular sector of the economy and where they would get mentorship. And it would be a situation where if you graduate from UG as a young person, we give you 100 acres of land because you would have been in all over Guyana. You would have seen the economic opportunities in agriculture and aquaculture and water-based industries. And we could have gotten 10 youth of all races, put them into a company, give them shares, and now they have 100 acres of land and they can do things because of economies of scale and access to markets. And we would have a youth development fund like in South Africa that would capitalize it. A revamped educational system, critical to youth development. 5, cooperatives. We have 3 modes of development in Guyana: public sector, private sector, and corps. When you look at the private sector, because of what I said initially of what our existing private sector was prior to oil and still is, traders, right? We needed to create corps so that our young people would have market entry into the business community using entrepreneurship as a vehicle. I also had here, and this was probably I was influenced at the time by Clive Thomas, a conditional cash transfer to our young people to help them to build equity, to help them to build capital. It would be linked to businesses. And take, for example, our corps, David. We would give cash transfer also to other Guyanese, age differentiated, like Brazil did with Bolsa Familia. So we would say to them, we're going to give you, say, 100,000 a month, but 3/4 of that will be in coupons. And those coupons will allow you to buy from certain stores, which our farmers would grow fruits and vegetables for you to buy. This way, we minimize our health budget. We have a healthier Guyana, and we empower our youth who are now farmers, so they got economies of scale, and then they could export. A reduction in corruption is necessary because corruption takes away so many assets. It creates a misaligned economy and all of that. A new immigration law. We, Guyana, in order to be sustainable, need 3 million people. Since the 1970s, we've been around 780. I think now we're about 1.1, 1.2 million. And a lot of it has to do with ethnic politics. We didn't want the road to Brazil because the Brazilians will run in here. And because 50% of the population of Brazil is black, we don't want black people here. We're seeing the same thing with Haiti. Haiti got some of the best agricultural people in the world, but we didn't want them here then, and we didn't want them here now because it changes the ethnic voting arrangement. So everything we seem to do, immigration laws, right now, we don't want Nigerians here, right? Even though they're part of the Commonwealth, even though we're talking about Africa-Caribbean, solidarity and reciprocity. A local content law, number 9. And I spoke about that in the context, and I wrote about it. I said we do not need a local content law because a local content law essentially deals with global connotations. Local content means many things in different parts of the world. We should have a national content law, not a local content. And by making it a national content law, we get away from the fact that if it's a local content law, because we're part of CARICOM and all the treaties we've signed, a Trinidadian firm has equal rights as a Guyanese firm. A Trinidadian or Jamaican company has equal rights to buy our land, to do all sorts of things. This way, if we had a national content law, we could protect our land, we could protect our resources, and we could provide those to youth as capital, as equity, to get involved in entrepreneurship and business. The other thing I had here in order for youth unemployment and youth development was catalytic diasporic investments. We got diaspora all over the world doing extremely well. We needed to link our diaspora in certain sectors with our youth. And you have to put programs in place. You have to put infrastructure in place. That's where you get the mentorship. That's where you get the nurturing. And now that we have oil, because we'd never had this connection, our youth are even more lost because they're uneducated. They don't have technology accepted. And then, of course, we had to build a new capital because Georgetown is 6 feet under level. And that building of a new capital would have employed our youth. For example, you could have taken 10 of our youth, taught them different skills to build a home, put them together to build homes for themselves, and then form them into a company. And that company would then essentially go out and build houses for other communities. So that's what I was writing about in this document called Youth Development, talking in terms of why it is we have youth unemployment, why is it we have an economy that is stagnant, what it is we need to take to improve the economy. Now, as you notice, David, this is all youth because, as you said earlier, we're inclusive. When I was at UG, I taught all youth equally. They're all Guyanese. So this would have had a multiplying effect in our economy where our youth, through economic inclusion, would move towards social inclusion. Right now, all we're pushing is through One Guyana is social cohesion and social inclusion. But for sustainability, for economic growth, you need economic inclusion. And the mechanisms we discussed in this document would have created economic inclusion of all races, and that would have led to social inclusion and social cohesion. I then went further for African people in particular, and I created a Ubuntu leadership program. This program, David, has the following characteristics, and I designed it after the White House Fellow Leadership Program I was involved. Every week, we would have leaders, African leaders in the diaspora and on the continent, speaking to this group of 100 Black youth on Zoom, telling them about business experiences, telling them about business opportunities, mentoring them. Secondly, once a month, we would do a book by a great African philosopher, and we would alternate it every month by a business book. And there we would have people come from all over the world and talk to them about the book, dissect the book, talk about principles of entrepreneurship, talk about success, because success breeds success. We talk about leadership. We talk about business opportunities. We would also teach them about their culture. We would teach them about servant leadership, because that's what you need to build Guyana, not the type of hierarchical autocratic leadership we have. We need servant leadership, right? Where the servant leaders create other leaders and take care of the community instead of self. So this is an extensive program. It's about 60 pages that I've developed so that our youth would get over the hurdle of not being properly educated, of having no mentors, of not being exposed. Because if they're exposed to 100 people from all over the world who are successful, Dangote and all these people who would speak to them for 2 hours, right? Because the program would be 3 times a week. One would be on entrepreneurship, one would be on leadership, and one would be on being exposed to mentors and business networks. All of this has been written up. And this feeds into the document I spoke about last week, developing African Guyanese middle class and African Guyanese business community featuring youth. So I just wanted to give you that context to talk about youth, all youth, but in particular, it would be focused to some extent on African youth, because if other youth are far advanced and African youth are not, if they don't have the networks, the partnerships, the capital, the access to technology, then they would fall apart. Now, in terms of local content, I also wrote about that. I said that we should have 30% local content Guyanese of everything that Exxon does. But in that 30%, because of the evolution of the business sector in Guyana, where Jagan went to India and brought Corpulani and all these other people, and where the disadvantage of Africans because of exclusion from procurement, that any contract that would be given to a Guyanese company would have a subcontract to African Amerindian groups, where you would build them over time, the capacity, the et cetera, et cetera. I just want to stop there because I can go on and on and on in terms of the books they would read, the philosophies they would read. But it all comes back to my African Renaissance. Be independent, self-determination, building your community, sharing with your community. We build together, we share together, we are one for all Guyana.
Eric, have you been able to interest anyone close to power and authority in this plan?
I shared this with the last government in many different ways, starting with a 10-point plan after former President Granger had come up with a 10-point plan for Amerindian community. I shared with him with that. We then looked at all the sectors of the economy, and we said that to create a black business class, you need a banking license and you need an African Development Fund, because that's the only way you could revitalize your villages. But the villages have to become remodernized and remission, because the crops they're growing are cash crops, and that's not sustainable. You have markets. So we would go and get a contract from a country like Nigeria, who bought $40 billion in rice last year, and we would come to Guyana and get 10 farmers with 10,000 acres, and that would be their target. And we would ask the Nigerians to forward invest, put together some money so that they can buy the equipment and tools and seeds and do the soil testing and the packaging for that market. You could do that with different crops. So each village, after being soil tested, would have that. I also have another document here, which is called Community Development, Village Diversification and Generational Wealth Creation through Entrepreneurship. And the goals of this initiative are economic revitalization of 10 villages, sustainable and synergistic partnership in 10 communities. So in essence, what I would have done, David, was to go to 10 villages, get 10 individuals, male and female, and take them through this program, the same process that the Amerindians have gone through in terms of their community development plans, and train them to create a business to develop their communities. So if Buxton or Queenstown or Anna Regina or whoever it is, based on their soil testing, based on who lives there, based on the markets available, we would target them. We would support them also with legislation. We would have different, how could I put it? We'd have different conditions for our youth versus businesses that are more mature, so that we give them a lift. And all of this would replicate through the economy. It would replicate through the education system, because the education system would now be directed towards a particular type of entrepreneurship and self-determination and self-employment that we would need to sustain Guyana even before oil. Now with oil, it's even worse. The situation is even more in crisis, with our education system being misaligned, with our lack of resources for our young people. One of the key determinants of whether young people will succeed is something called agency. Our young people don't have agency in Guyana. They're afraid to speak. They're afraid to do things. They don't have mentors that will pull them along. All of this is called agency. They need agency, they need assets, they need mentorship, they need nurturing, and they need guidance. We do none of that to our youth.
You obviously put this plan together before the onset of oil, right?
Yes, since 1996, I've been working on this with the Guyana 21 plan that had some elements. Then in 2008, as I mentioned to you, when I went into Buxton, Agricola, and Alboystown and saw the conditions, and then I started writing about the literacy in 2008. I did the 10-10-10 plan in 2010 for Linden. We did the Guyana 2030 rebirth. Now that we have oil, African Business Council, African Business Roundtable, etc., etc. It's all a part of a learning process for me as I started to understand the environment. But one of the most difficult things is this winner-take-all, because with a winner-take-all constitution, African Guyanese will never be able to create a sustainable middle class or a sustainable business community because of ethnic tribalism and the way budgets are constructed. And you could see it now with the oil economy, where money is going, whose villages are being built, whose roads are being resurfaced, where wastewater treatment plants are going, where medical centers are going. All of it is so transparent if you look at it and you understand it in the context of what's in the best interest of Guyana, all races. You look at Amerindians, they have all these lands, they have no capital. Do they have access to subsurface rights, mineral rights? No. All these things are linked together. It's an ethnocracy and an autocracy. And it's not in the best interest of Guyana or Guyana's youth. Guyana's education system will always be sub-optimized because we are always looking for a small number of people to control all the businesses and all the wealth. And it's unsustainable because foreigners will come in and uproot you because they'll always have more money than you, more capital than you, and they're more ruthless than you.
When you look at the developmental plans of the governing party, the opposition parties, is there space in there to accommodate this plan that you are outlining here tonight?
This plan could be implemented tomorrow.
But do you see any
No, there's
space?
no will to do it. There's no political will,
Why?
because we're down a particular path of exclusivity, of exclusion, of a small group getting all the wealth. I mean, I was shocked today, even though I'd suspected it. We're getting 1.39 barrels out of every 100 barrels of oil. Why? Because we're paying Exxon taxes. We get $300 something billion, and we pay $300 something billion in taxes, their taxes. So when you look at how the economy is structured, how the infrastructure is being put in place, you will see that there is a vision of a Guyana that is very exclusive, and the majority of people are going to be left out. Yes, there'll be infrastructure and they'll benefit from it, but they won't have the key jobs. They won't control the economy. They won't have ownership of their lands. Land values will go up and they'll be excluded. Pretty soon, in 5 years, they won't be able. Young people aren't going to be able to buy a home or rent an apartment, and because of the educational system, they can't compete. I know we have goal and all these programs, but these programs are not mission directed to the direction which the economy needs to go. And if you were to step back and say, how do I include all Guyana, you would take a whole different perspective of how this economy should grow and who gets contracts and who doesn't get contracts. Because the people you're leaving out are the people who are going to become revolutionaries.
Mm-hmm. Brother Eric Phillips here tonight. We are talking about youth development in Guyana, in particular African Guyanese youth. And Brother Eric is, of course, bemoaning the fact that the government in particular, which is in the best position to come up with a youth development plan, has absolutely no interest in that.
The interest is infrastructure, because infrastructure is easy. And from infrastructure, you could steal a lot, and you can have recurring contracts because the work is going to be subpar. So you're creating a recurring economy for your friends and family.
So, Brother Eric, as we close out, where do we go from here as far as our young people are concerned? Because you look around, you see school dropout is almost 50%, illiteracy rate.
You know, David, you hit a big point there. We're talking about the drop in rates, passing rates. But that's those who took the exam. We got a dropout rate that is huge, that is not even reflected in that failure rate. We need to add them to that, and then you'll see like 70% or 80% of our kids are failing math, because most of them can't even take the exam. So they failed. And now we're in a high-tech economy with oil. We're a high-tech economy in agriculture. We're into AI. We're into all sorts of new technologies, artificial intelligence, etc. And we are left without any opportunities for our young people. And that is where democracy is centered around youth development. As I said in the beginning, youth are the essence of development, not older people, youth, because they're the ones who have the vitality to push the economy, to bring innovation, to come up with creative ideas, to look at things differently. And we're not teaching them to think. A lot of the students are just cramming stuff. That's why they can do 28 subjects, because it's just answers, It's not about thinking. And in order to compete, you got to think. You got to be able to solve problems. Critical thinking is not taught in our schools. But you have to also have leadership. And you need to have servant leadership, not autocratic leadership.
Brother Eric Phillips here tonight, Chief Eric Phillips, walking us through the need for a youth development plan. We'll continue this conversation. As you know, every Wednesday we come here and we talk about African Guyanese issue. Brother Eric, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Chief Uhuru. Thank you.
Brother Eric Phillips here tonight, and we continue our conversation tomorrow night. I think I have, who do I have tomorrow night? I know I have a couple of people tomorrow night, but we come back tomorrow night to continue our conversation on our country and where it is going. So until tomorrow night, stay good and make sure you join us same time, same place.